A medieval woman could legally own and run a brewery, and many did, sometimes even becoming alewives in charge of quality control for an entire town. Some noblewomen in the 12th century were more literate than their knightly husbands, managing vast estates and corresponding about politics and finances. Forget constant chastity belts. Actual medical texts from the period discussed female pleasure and orgasm as beneficial for conception. Number 10. They were all helpless damsels waiting for a knight. Picture this. A lady trapped in a tower, right? Well, how about Nicolaa de la Haye? In 1217, she was in her 60s and inherited the title of Sheriff of Lincolnshire. When French forces, allied with rebel English barons, besieged Lincoln Castle, Nicolaa herself commanded the defense. She held out for weeks against a much larger army until reinforcements arrived. No fainting, no screaming for a hero, just steely determination. Then there's Jeanne de Clisson, the Lioness of Britain. After her husband was executed for treason by the French king in 1343, she didn't just weep. She sold her remaining lands, bought 3 warships, painted them black with red sails, and launched a pirate campaign against French ships in the English Channel. For years, her Black Fleet terrorized French commerce, and she was known to personally lead boarding parties, axe in hand, often slaughtering entire crews, but sparing a few to tell the tale. And let's not forget women on crusades. They weren't all laundresses and camp followers. Some noble women, like Eleanor of Aquitaine, on the Second Crusade, brought their own entourages and played political roles. Florine of Burgundy, a Danish princess who married a crusader, actually fought alongside her husband in Anatolia during the First Crusade. Accounts tell of her pierced by 7 arrows, still fighting to defend him before they were both overwhelmed. Even in less dramatic settings, women weren't passively waiting. Consider townswomen defending their homes during sieges. During the Siege of Toulouse in 1218, women were recorded operating mangonels, a type of catapult, and helping to repair fortifications under fire. One well-aimed stone from a machine operated by women is said to have killed Simon de Montfort, the leader of the Albigensian Crusade. The image of the delicate flower often comes from chivalric romances, which were popular entertainment, not exact reflections of everyday life for all women. While ideals of feminine grace existed, the reality often demanded resilience and action. Number 9. They had absolutely no legal rights or power. It's easy to imagine medieval women as legal non-entities, like furniture owned by their fathers or husbands. But the legal landscape was way more complex. Take dower rights, for instance. When a woman married, she was typically entitled to a portion of her husband's property, often 1/3 for her use if she were widowed. This dower was hers to manage and live off. She couldn't usually sell it. It would pass to his heirs, but it gave her economic security. Then there's the femme sole status. In many medieval towns, particularly in England, a married woman involved in a trade separate from her husband's could be recognized as a femme sole, legally a single woman for business purposes. This meant she could enter into contracts, sue, and be sued in her own name regarding her business. Think of brewers, bakers, weavers, and merchants operating their own shops. Guild records from cities like London or Paris list many women members, sometimes as widows carrying on their husband's trade, other times as independent artisans. What about inheritance? While sons often got the lion's share, daughters could and did inherit land and property, especially if there were no male heirs. Noble women in particular could become incredibly powerful heiresses, controlling vast estates. Eleanor of Aquitaine inherited the entire Duchy of Aquitaine, making her one of the wealthiest and most powerful figures in Europe, more powerful than the King of France, whom she married first. Women could also appear in court. They could bring lawsuits, especially concerning property, dower, or debt. They could also be called as witnesses. Of course, their legal standing wasn't equal to men's. For example, their testimony might be valued less in some situations. But no legal rights is a huge overstatement. Abbesses, the heads of convents, were particularly powerful. They managed large land holdings, owed military service to the crown, which they'd pay for by sending knights, and even sat in some parliamentary assemblies or councils. Hilda of Whitby, way back in the 7th century, hosted a major church synod. Even peasant women had some recourse. Manorial court rolls show women bringing cases against others for things like assault or theft. While the system was heavily weighted towards men and the powerful, it wasn't a complete legal void for women. Number 8. All medieval women were uneducated and illiterate. If you think medieval women spent their days staring blankly because they couldn't read, think again. Literacy levels were lower overall than today, for men too, but education for women definitely existed, especially for those in higher social circles. Many girls from noble or wealthy merchant families were taught to read, often by tutors or in nunneries. The focus was often on religious texts, like the Psalter or Books of Hours, but this provided a foundation. They needed to manage households, understand accounts if they were widowed, and sometimes engage in correspondence. Letters survive from medieval women discussing everything from estate management to personal feelings. Margaret Paston, from 15th century England, wrote many letters showing her active role in managing family affairs and legal disputes while her husband was away. Nunneries were significant centers of learning for women. Abbesses were often highly educated women, and nuns would learn Latin, read religious texts, and some even engaged in scholarly pursuits. Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century German abbess, was a writer, composer, philosopher, mystic, visionary, and medical writer. She wrote theological books, liturgical songs, and even a medical treatise, Physica, and a book on materia medica and cures, causae et curae. Her correspondence network included popes and emperors. Christine de Pizan, born in Italy in the late 14th century, became the first professional female writer in Europe, supporting herself, her mother, and her children through her writing after her husband died. She wrote poetry, and importantly, works defending women like the Book of the City of Ladies, 1405, which highlighted famous women throughout history and argued for female education. She ran her own scriptorium, employing scribes and illustrators. Even beyond the elite, some level of practical literacy or numeracy existed. Townswomen running businesses would need some ability to keep accounts. While they might not be composing poetry in Latin, they weren't necessarily cut off from the written word. Vernacular literature, stories and poems in everyday languages like English, French, or German became increasingly popular, and women were a significant part of the audience, and sometimes patrons. Art also shows women reading. Depictions of the Virgin Mary often show her with a book at the Annunciation. While this is symbolic, it also normalized the image of a woman reading for those who saw the art. So, while universal education was centuries away, the idea of the universally ignorant medieval woman just doesn't hold up. Number 7. Their lives revolved solely around housework and child rearing. Sure, managing a household and raising children were huge parts of many medieval women's lives, but to say that's all they did is like saying all modern people do is use spacex. It misses a massive chunk of reality. Think about agriculture, the backbone of the medieval economy. Peasant women worked in the fields alongside men. They sowed seeds, weeded, harvested crops, tended livestock, and processed food, like grinding grain or making cheese and butter. Their labor was essential for the survival of their families and the functioning of the manorial system. Court roles and illustrations from the period show women engaged in all sorts of farm work. In towns and cities, women were deeply involved in commerce and crafts. As mentioned before, many women were femme souls running their own businesses. They were brewers. Brewing was often dominated by women, called alewives, bakers, spinners, weavers, tailors, and retailers of all sorts. Guild records across Europe list female members. In Paris by the late 13th century, several guilds were exclusively female, like those for silk spinners and embroiderers. Others had many female members working alongside men. What about more specialized roles? Midwifery was almost exclusively a female profession. Midwives learned their skills through apprenticeship and experience, assisting with childbirth and providing postnatal care. While not formally trained in universities like male physicians, who rarely attended births anyway, skilled midwives were highly valued in their communities. Women also acted as healers, using herbal remedies and traditional knowledge. In noble households, the lady of the manor had immense responsibilities, especially when her husband was away at war or court, which could be for long periods. She managed the estate, oversaw finances, supervised servants and agricultural workers, dispensed justice in local matters, and even organized the defense of the manor, if necessary. This was a complex administrative job. Even in the arts, women made contributions. We know of female scribes and illuminators, often working in convents, but sometimes in secular workshops. And a 10th century Spanish nun is one of the earliest named female manuscript illuminators in Europe, signing her work on the Gerona Beatus manuscript. So, while domestic duties were undeniably central, medieval women's lives were often filled with a wide range of economic, agricultural, and even artisanal activities that were crucial to their society. Number 6. They were always forced into loveless marriages as children. The image of a tearful 12-year-old noble girl being dragged to the altar to marry a grizzled old duke for political alliance is a powerful one, and yes, child betrothals and politically motivated marriages certainly happened, especially in the highest echelons of society. Alliances were critical, and cementing them through marriage was common practice. However, this wasn't the universal experience for all medieval women, nor was consent entirely absent from the picture. Church law, or canon law, which governed marriage throughout Western Europe, actually stipulated that marriage had to be consensual. Both the man and the woman had to give their free consent for the marriage to be valid. Of course, free consent could be a bit flexible, and parental pressure was immense. A young woman might consent because it was expected, or because the alternative, disobeying her family, potentially facing a difficult future, was worse. But the principle of consent existed. If it could be proven that consent was truly forced, a marriage could theoretically be annulled. What about age? While aristocratic girls might be married young, sometimes in their early teens, though consummation might be delayed, the average age of first marriage for peasant and townswomen was often much later, typically in their early to mid-20s. This is partly because a couple usually needed to establish their own household and have the economic means to support a family before marrying. Parish records and demographic studies suggest this later marriage age was common across many parts of Europe. And were all marriages loveless? That's hard to say definitively, as personal emotions are tricky to gauge from historical records. Marriages were often pragmatic arrangements focused on economic partnership, procreation, and social stability. However, this doesn't mean affection and companionship couldn't develop. Letters between spouses, like some of the Paston letters, show evidence of affection, concern, and partnership. Medieval literature, while often idealized, also explored themes of love within marriage. Advice manuals for married couples sometimes stressed the importance of mutual affection and kindness. Some women also chose not to marry at all. Entering a convent was a significant option for women, offering an alternative path that could include education, spiritual fulfillment, and positions of authority, like an abbess. While families might also pressure daughters into religious life, for some, it was a genuine choice. So, while arranged marriages and youthful brides existed particularly for the nobility, the idea that every medieval woman was a child bride, forced into a loveless union, doesn't match the broader historical evidence. Consent, at least in principle, mattered, and for many, marriage came later in life and could involve elements of partnership and even affection. Number 5, they were constantly pregnant and usually died in childbirth. Childbirth in the medieval period was undeniably dangerous. Without modern medical interventions like antibiotics, etc., sections, or blood transfusions, complications that are manageable today could be fatal. Maternal mortality rates were high compared to now. And yes, many women did die in childbirth or from postpartum infections. It was a leading cause of death for women of childbearing age. However, constantly pregnant and usually died in childbirth paints too bleak a picture. While families were often large, it wasn't necessarily a state of continuous pregnancy from puberty until death or menopause for every woman. Several factors could influence birth rates. Breastfeeding, for example, can naturally suppress ovulation and act as a form of child spacing. Medieval women typically breastfed their children for extended periods, often up to 2 years. Nutritional status also played a role. Women who were malnourished might have lower fertility or be more susceptible to complications. Furthermore, while contraception methods were rudimentary and often unreliable by modern standards, and sometimes condemned by the Church, people did have some knowledge of herbal remedies or practices believed to prevent conception or induce abortion, though their effectiveness is debatable and their use risky If a woman survived her childbearing years, she could live a reasonably long life for the period. The overall low average life expectancy in the Middle Ages, often cited as around 30 to 35, is heavily skewed by very high rates of infant and child mortality. If you survived childhood, your chances of reaching 50, 60, or even older were much better. Many women lived to see their grandchildren. Archaeological evidence from skeletal remains can give us insights. While signs of multiple pregnancies can sometimes be seen on female skeletons, and evidence of death related to childbirth exists, it doesn't suggest every woman died this way. Wills and family records also show many women surviving multiple births and living into old age. Think of figures like Eleanor of Aquitaine, who had 10 children with 2 husbands and lived to be about 82. Or Christine de Pizan, who had 3 children and lived into her 60s. While these are notable individuals, they illustrate that a life cut short in childbirth wasn't the inevitable fate of all medieval women. Childbirth was a profound risk, a life or death event each time, but many women navigated it successfully multiple times. The fear was real, but so was survival. Number 4. They were always silent, submissive, and hidden away. The popular image often portrays medieval women as meek, quiet figures, always deferring to men and having no public voice or influence. While societal norms did emphasize female modesty and obedience, especially in public and religious discourse, the reality was far more dynamic. Consider queens and noblewomen. Queens consort like Eleanor of Aquitaine or Blanche of Castile, mother of Louis IX of France, often wielded significant political influence, acting as regents for their young sons, advising their husbands, managing diplomatic relations, and patronizing arts and learning diplomatic relations, and patronizing arts and learning. Blanche of Castile effectively ruled France for a period and was a formidable political operator. When noblemen were away, at war, crusades, or court, their wives, the chatelaines, were often in charge of vast estates, responsible for their administration, defense, and legal affairs. This required decisiveness and authority, not silent submission. Abbesses, as heads of wealthy and influential nunneries, were powerful figures. They managed large agricultural estates, oversaw communities of nuns, interacted with secular lords and church officials, and sometimes even had a say in regional politics. Some abbesses of major convents were essentially feudal lords in their own right. Even outside the nobility, women found ways to have their voices heard. In towns, women participated in the marketplace, not just as buyers, but as sellers and producers. Guild records show women negotiating, making contracts, and sometimes even taking disputes to court. While they might not be shouting from the rooftops, their economic activity gave them a form of public presence and agency. Women also participated in religious life beyond just attending church. Some became influential mystics, like Julian of Norwich or Marjorie Kempe in England. Julian wrote Revelations of Divine Love, one of the earliest surviving books in English written by a woman, offering profound theological insights. Marjorie Kempe dictated. The Book of Marjorie Kempe, an autobiography detailing her spiritual experiences, pilgrimages, and outspoken religious views, which often got her into trouble with authorities, but certainly wasn't silent. Petitions provide another glimpse. Women, individually or in groups, would petition kings, lords, or church authorities for redress of grievances, for charity, or for legal intervention. These documents show women actively engaging with power structures to advocate for themselves or their families. Of course, there were strong societal pressures for women to be demure. Religious teachings often emphasized female subordination. But to equate this ideal with the lived reality of all women is to ignore the many ways they navigated, influenced, and sometimes challenged the world around them. From the queen on her throne to the market woman haggling over prices, medieval women were not universally silent or invisible. Number 3, they cared only about chastity or were dangerously seductive. Medieval views on female sexuality were complex and often contradictory, leading to the enduring stereotypes of women as either impossibly pure virgins, obsessed with chastity, or as dangerous Eve-like seductresses, threatening men's souls. The reality, as usual, was somewhere in between and far more nuanced. Chastity was highly valued, especially for unmarried women, and within marriage, in the sense of fidelity. Virginity before marriage was a strong social and religious ideal, particularly for women from noble and respectable families, as it was linked to family honor and the legitimacy of heirs. Dowries could be affected by a bride's perceived virtue. Religious figures like the Virgin Mary were held up as the ultimate models of purity. However, this intense focus on chastity doesn't mean all women lived in constant fear of losing it, or that it was their sole defining characteristic. Life went on. Medical texts from the period, like those attributed to Tertulla of Salerno, a name associated with a group of female medical practitioners from the 11th–12th centuries, discussed female anatomy and sexuality with a surprising frankness for the time. Some texts even acknowledged female orgasm and considered it important for conception and general well-being. The Tertulla texts offered advice on gynecological issues, childbirth, and even cosmetics, indicating a concern for women's health and appearance beyond just spiritual purity. The idea of the dangerous seductress was also potent, often fueled by clerical anxieties about temptation. Eve's role in the Garden of Eden was frequently cited. Women were sometimes depicted as inherently weaker, more susceptible to sin, and capable of leading men astray. This stereotype could have serious consequences, especially during periods of heightened religious fervor or social unrest, sometimes contributing to accusations of witchcraft. Though the major witch hunts were more a feature of the early modern period, the groundwork was laid earlier. But everyday life was more practical. Marital relationships, while not always based on romantic love in the modern sense, involved sexual relations for procreation and, as recognized by some theologians, for mutual comfort and to avoid temptation outside marriage, the marital debt owed by both spouses to each other. Popular literature, like fabliaux, short, often bawdy comic tales, frequently depicted women as assertive, cunning, and very much interested in sex, sometimes outside the bounds of marriage. While these were satirical, they show that a wider range of female behaviors and desires was acknowledged, even if disapproved of by official morality. Furthermore, not all women fit neatly into the virgin, wife, widow categories. Prostitution existed in medieval towns, often regulated by authorities, sometimes confined to specific districts. This acknowledges a spectrum of sexual behavior, albeit one that was often exploitative and dangerous for the women involved. So, while the ideals of chastity were powerful and fears of female seduction were real, medieval women's lives and the way society viewed their sexuality were far more complex than these two extremes suggest. They were human beings with a range of experiences, not just symbols of purity or temptation. Number 2. Medieval hygiene was so bad. everyone was constantly filthy. The popular image of medieval Europe is often one of mud, muck, and unwashed masses. While sanitation standards were certainly not up to modern levels, no running hot water on tap or antibacterial soap, the idea that everyone was perpetually caked in dirt and oblivious to hygiene is an exaggeration. Personal cleanliness was valued. Religious teachings often emphasized purity, which could extend to physical cleanliness as a metaphor for spiritual purity. Hand-washing, especially before meals, was a common practice, even a ritual in noble households. Books of etiquette from the period advised on washing hands and face daily. Bathing was more common than many people think. While private bathtubs in homes were a luxury for the wealthy, public bathhouses known as stews were present in many medieval towns and cities from the 12th century onwards. People would go there to bathe in hot water, socialize, and sometimes even have a meal. Records show regulations for these bathhouses, indicating they were a recognized part of urban life. Of course, the Black Death in the mid-14th century led to a decline in the popularity of public baths, as people became suspicious of places where many gathered, and some associated them with the spread of disease or immoral behavior. But for a significant portion of the Middle Ages, public bathing was an option. Even without full immersion baths, people washed. Basins and ewers for washing hands and face were common household items. Soap, made from animal fats and ashes, was known and used, though it might not have been the scented, gentle varieties we have today. Soap makers were a recognized craft. What about teeth? People did care about dental hygiene, at least to some extent. Recipes for tooth powders and mouthwashes existed, often using herbs like mint, sage, or rosemary to freshen breath or clean teeth. Twigs were sometimes used as rudimentary toothbrushes. Archaeological finds of skeletons often show teeth worn down by a gritty diet, but not necessarily universally rotten from total neglect. Laundry was a regular chore. Linen undergarments, which became more common during the Middle Ages, were washed more frequently than outer woolen garments, which were more durable and harder to clean. Having clean linen next to the skin was a mark of personal hygiene. Perfumes, scented waters, and sachets of herbs were used to combat body odor and make clothing smell pleasant. People grew herbs like lavender and rosemary in their gardens for this purpose. Of course, living conditions for the poor, especially in crowded urban areas, could be unsanitary. Waste disposal was a major problem, and streets could indeed be dirty. But this doesn't mean individuals didn't try to keep themselves clean within the limits of their resources and knowledge. The medieval world wasn't uniformly a stinking cesspit. There was an awareness of and an effort towards personal cleanliness, even if the methods and results differed greatly from our own. Number 1. All women were either downtrodden peasants or pampered princesses. This is one of the most persistent simplifications. When we think medieval woman, the mind often jumps to a serf toiling endlessly in a muddy field or a queen draped in jewels, with very little in between. But medieval society was far more diverse than this binary allows, and women occupied a vast range of social and economic positions. Let's start with the urban centers. Medieval towns and cities were bustling hubs of craft and commerce, and women were integral to this urban economy. There was a significant middle class of artisans, merchants, and shopkeepers. Women in these families often worked alongside their husbands or even ran their own businesses, as we've seen with femme sole traders. They could be skilled brewers, bakers, weavers, spinners, milliners, or retailers of various goods. The wives and daughters of master craftsmen often learned the trade and could continue the business if widowed. Guild records provide evidence of these active, economically productive urban women who were neither peasants nor royalty. Within the church, beyond the powerful abbesses we've mentioned, there were ordinary nuns who dedicated their lives to prayer, work, and sometimes scholarship or charitable activities like running hospitals or almshouses. There were also lay religious women, like beguines in Northern Europe. Communities of women who lived pious lives together, often supporting themselves through crafts like weaving or nursing, without taking formal vows. This offered a degree of autonomy and community outside traditional marriage or monastic structures. Even within the peasantry, there was variation. Not all peasants were destitute serfs. Some were free peasants who owned or rented land and had more control over their lives and labor. The wife of a prosperous, free peasant would have had a different life experience from the wife of a serf bound to the land with few resources. Consider service roles. Many women worked as domestic servants in wealthier households, from noble castles to merchant homes. This provided employment, though conditions could vary greatly. Some women found roles as wet nurses, a crucial service in an era of high infant mortality and where noble women might not always breastfeed their own children. There were also women involved in intellectual and artistic pursuits outside of formal religious orders, though they are harder to trace. We know of female troubadours, or troubarettes, in southern France in the 12th and 13th centuries, who composed and performed courtly poetry. While often from noble backgrounds, they were artists in their own right. And then there were women on the margins of society, the very poor vagrants, or those accused of crimes. Their lives were undoubtedly harsh, but they too were part of the medieval female experience. The point is, medieval society was a complex tapestry, not a simple black and white picture. Women's lives were shaped by their social class, geographical location, urban or rural, different kingdoms with varying laws, family wealth, and individual circumstances. Reducing them to just two categories, peasant or princess, erases the rich diversity of their experiences and contributions to medieval life.